What is going on? Welcome back to the show. Today I am joined by my man Steve Hall. Steve, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's always fun having a chat with Jeremiah because you're a cool guy and it's clued up. So I know it's always going to be an interesting chat.
Absolutely means the world. Now you've been on the show before. You were one of the very first guests that I had on. I was so fucking nervous for that episode. So hopefully I can formulate sentences a little bit better this time around. We give us just, I'm imagining by this point, I've shouted you out quite a bit on the show talking about what we've been doing. And I imagine some of the listeners have listened to like the first episode. Will you just give us a super brief intro on like who you are, what you do?
Totally. So yeah, I didn't even realize I was one of the first episodes. I felt like when I came on, it felt like quite an established podcast. So
You
yeah,
were
no,
my third guest.
that's amazing. That's awesome. So yeah, I mean, I'm Steve Hall of like Revive Stronger. So it's a company that I have founded along now with my business partner, Pascal Floor. And we have a coaching team. So we coach people online to their physique goals, basically try and maximize fat loss, muscle gain for their kind of particular lifestyle and circumstances, and try and do it in a evidence-based manner that's kind of safe, productive, and efficient, all those sort of things. And we're a content provider as well. So we have our own podcast, the Revive Stronger podcast, and I get to interview like proper experts in the field. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I know some stuff, but these guys are ridiculously smart. So I'm honored to be able to do that and share knowledge with people. And then I myself am a natural bodybuilder. So competed twice, done pretty badly, done pretty okay, pretty decently. And now I'm hoping to compete next year if the corona will let us do that. And yeah, I personally am just very, very invested into my bodybuilding. I like being deep in the trenches because I feel like that makes me a better coach. And so if I try and maximize what I do on my end, I feel like I can help my clients maximize what they do on their end. So yeah, that's me.
Absolutely. I love it, man. And I can say for sure from following you, I think you're, as far as natural bodybuilders go, you're probably one of the most dedicated people I've seen.
I appreciate that. I think it comes to, it's like, it's almost a flaw in some ways in my character, but also a positive because it's like, I can't not be like consistent and do it. Like if
Right.
something isn't done in a day, like I feel like it feels like a bit of OCD in some ways. So no, I
Right.
appreciate that. I just, yeah, fall in love with the process.
Do you feel like that's how you are with business as well?
A little bit. To like one really easy example that comes to mind is like Instagram. Some days I have nothing on my mind that I want to say on like stories or something, but I'm like, I feel like I need to be present because
Right.
I'm always present every day. I turn up every day. Or even like an Instagram post, for example, like every day I do a post. I used to do 2 posts every single day,
Yeah.
and I stopped that a while ago. And even now, some days I'm just like, do I really have to do a post today? But it feels so wrong not to. So I'm
Right.
like, I need to do my post, and even to the point where I'll probably double post in a day if it hurts how my what's it called when you come onto my profile and I have like infographics are like always
Okay.
the third post. So if it kind of obscures that, I get quite upset. So yeah, I think it gives you a bit of an insight into my character.
I feel like I'm that same way, and especially like with the business side of things, training as well. But the business side of things, like it, I can't. It drives me crazy. Like the thought of like you have this streak of consistency, right? And it's so like I think it's also very much a gift and a curse. Like I imagine for you, it's really helped grow Revive Stronger. But I know for me, like with my relationships, sometimes that's like where it's like, okay, why can't you just turn this off for a little bit and be present with like whatever's going on, right? Have you ever, kind of a different topic than I wanted to dive into here, but is that something you've struggled with or like kind of trying to find the balance there?
Absolutely. I'd say something that really helps me personally is I know it almost sounds wrong because it's like on or off. Like we always talk about, like, well, you probably always talk about it as well. Like there's not an on and off switch. You kind of
Right.
want to have a bit of a
The
dimmer
dial.
switch to your diet. Yeah, dial it in. So I feel like I'd like if I had that with my training and you like my training at least and kind of my business. But in many ways, I do much better if I'm just removed from it. So the best things I can sometimes do is just like if I'm like having dinner out with my girlfriend, it's not even maybe look at my like maybe I'd want to look at my phone 10 times. So maybe I'll taper it to 5. Actually,
Right.
let's just put it in my pocket away so I just don't look at it at all. Or like if I'm out and about with a friend, I just make a kind of, I'm not looking at my phone whilst I'm out and about with them, because just being able to look at emails and like glancing at them and not being able to fully reply will stress the shit out of me anyway.
Oh, yeah.
So kind of, I just put the phone away that entire time. And it kind of, people talk about like social media detoxes or whatever, and having those days intermittently here and there where I'm just like removed for like at least half a day, I just don't look at my phone. That really helps. But it's certainly something I've struggled with, particularly training. I know in the past I've got better. I still feel like I'm miles away from like a real healthy relationship and not obsessed a bit with training.
Right.
Like a lot, probably we are like a bit obsessive with it, but like to the point where I'd be on holiday and like I don't need to train. Maybe I'll even like planned a deload week that week, but I've like found this really cool gym that I want to go and train in and like walk 2 hours to in the morning. And it's like, come on. Like the last time I did that was in 2017 after my contest prep, and me and Charlotte had gone to Mexico. And like I just found a cool gym. I was like, looking back in hindsight, I'm like, why did I do that? Like, it didn't take away from like the holiday because it was while Charlotte was in bed, but it just stressed me out even having to think and do that. Just like, I'd like to be able to, I think as I mature in that sense, I'll get better with that. But so, yeah, moderating those sort of things has been hard.
Super, super relatable. I appreciate you sharing all that, because I feel like hear you talk about like training, nutrition, things like that a lot, but it's interesting to hear you kind of dive into like, and I know you even dived into a bit like in our conversations through coaching, just like your philosophies more on like life, just a bit. I've heard you touch on things here and there, and it's always super interesting to hear like other people I look up to's perspective. So super interesting. Anyways, my man, I want to dive into programming for the recreational bodybuilder just a bit. Sound good?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I really just want to talk through kind of mesocycle design, and then even across the mesocycle, how you progress things, or we could say, and then like the macro cycle view as well. So first and foremost, I'd really just like to dive into exercise selection, which is, again, like when I started coaching with you, something that was super interesting, because I was very much, and I think that a lot of coaches get this almost to the point of like, I had learned a ton about like, okay, we're diving into biomechanics, resistance profiles of different movements, almost to the point where I think I was overthinking it a bit much. So my question for you is, what are we looking for in a movement specific to hypertrophy? Like, what are some things we're looking for? For example, like range of motion, eccentrics, things like that. Can you dive into that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just finding the infographic that I remember making, and I was like, I want to get this right, because I did a presentation on the members site that we have to kind of going over like principled exercise selection, I called it.
Right.
And I actually began that, and I remember beginning that conversation with like, it's not something that's heavily researched and really convincingly researched. So it's,
Right.
when we're talking evidence-based practice, we take the evidence, we take our own personal experience and kind of what we've seen with our clients. And a lot of that for exercise selection, then there's a lot of kind of, there's not that much evidence to give us like a starting ground. Particularly, there is some evidence, but a lot of it just comes down to kind of what you've seen working with individuals and things like this. So that's why I think when people talk about exercise selection and like the biomechanics and everything, because there's not loads of science like evidence and like papers behind it, people have very differing opinions almost. So that's why I liked the kind of going through some principles and setting those up, because it allowed me to kind of dissect exercises a little bit easier, and it allows people to do that. And I have to give props to Menno Henselmans for, he had like his, I think he has his own principles. He has like an article on that. And I kind of went through that and I was like, okay, like I said, people have different opinions on things. So I had my slight different kind of understanding of the way things maybe went. So yeah, if I can just take through kind of the breakdown of that. And the first one for me was specificity. So like as a general training principle, specificity is like number one. What we're doing in the gym needs to be in line with our goals. I can even remember for like when I first got introduced to the principle of specificity, I looked at my program, I was like, damn, there's stuff I've got in here that really isn't just specific to muscle growth. Like I had sets of like threes, and I was like, really, threes? That's more of the strength. That's not really specific to what I'm trying to do. I had GPP in my program. I do quite a lot of general physical preparedness. So I just thought they were good ideas. And so the principles really allowed me to be like, right, specificity, like this grows the target muscle that I'm trying to achieve. So you can immediately think of something like a Bosu bot squat or something. Well, it's not very specific towards muscle growth. Sure, it's a squat, but we're kind of training balance and other things in there. It's not super specific. Or like farmers walks. Yeah, I mean, we're getting some traps there, maybe some core, but it's not super specific as a muscle growth movement. Or things like clean and jerks. I think some guys like to get into the Olympic lifts for muscle building. They're not terrible. Like Olympic lifters are jacked often, but
Right.
they're not the most specific a lift. So specificity is the first one. You need to look at your exercise and be like, this is a specific exercise for hypertrophy. So we also want that to be a compound movement generally. I think Menno actually introduced me to the term compoundedness. So that was kind of like, it's not a real word, but it's a
Okay, I was
compound
gonna
movement,
say.
basically. It's like the compoundedness of a movement. So how compound-like is it? So we probably don't want to have an exercise full of just isolation movements.
Right.
It's probably not the most efficient way to train. It's not the most homeostatically disruptive way. Most like the stimulus isn't as high if we're doing things that way. So compound lifts that use multiple muscle groups, like many joints involved, are going to be a little bit more hypertrophic for the most part for most individuals. And yeah, sure, isolation movements definitely have their part, but for the most part, we want to prioritize compound movements like over isolation. So when we're thinking about like the quads, for example, you're not going to get as much hypertrophy from 4 sets of leg extensions as 4 sets of high bar squats, like deep high
Right.
bar squats. It's just the stimulus is going to be way out for a high bar squat, and there's more muscle groups involved as well versus the leg extension, which unfortunately isn't going to. So that's just specificity, compoundedness, and then the next one, range of motion. So we want to take movements through as full a range of motion as possible. There's been quite a lot of studies on range of motion. I think there's like 8 studies or something. I actually just recently looked at Brad Schoenfeld's book, which I have down here, Science and Development of Muscle, Muscle Hypertrophy, I think it is. And he basically is really cool. It's like a Bible of muscle hypertrophy because he just goes through the data and then he literally like has these kind of almost meta-analyses inside his book going through things like range of motion. So it's a really cool book. And basically, long story short, the kind of fuller a range of motion we use for a muscle group, more muscle fibers involved, therefore bigger hypertrophic stimulus. So we're not going to grow our most by doing like spoto press versus a full bench press to our pecs, or as low as we can go that's safe and comfortable in terms of range of motion. I guess I should clarify range of motion a little bit. And I actually would be really interested to hear what the researchers use for range of motion. I think I've asked a few experts on my podcast, like what they use for range of motion. I'm not sure any of them have given me a full, clear definition. I think Mike would probably know. Mike Israel would probably know, just because he seems to know everything. But generally, I think it's like for squats, when I think I asked Jacob Templar and I was like, what do they use for range of motion on squats? Like, I think basically the hips are below the knee crease. So like you're going below 90 degrees is generally like what they do for range of motion. So I think it's like those sort of things. They aren't really looking at active range of motion, which is often described and you talked about, where basically active range of motion is how far can you move in a movement plane with the muscle. So it's like, rather than thinking how far can you squat down with a bar on your back and go, how far can you, and like keep your heels on the ground and kind of keep in good form, not letting your lower back round, which a lot of us would think of range of motion and safe range of motion. Active range of motion is kind of like how low can you squat like without a bar on your back. So it's like just the muscles taking you into that position. Or on a leg press, how low can you kind of bring your legs down to yourself and keep your lower back down and everything without any load through your kind of legs. That essentially puts you into passive range of motion. So it's stretching other things which are involved. As far as I'm concerned, there isn't enough research to support active range of motion as being the way to go. It's also not clear that going through passive ranges is unsafe. The body is very plastic. You've probably been there, and I imagine a lot of the listeners, when I'm thinking about like a lot of my range of motion over the last years, it's improved because I've constantly gone through into a passive range and slowly got more and more flexible. It's like no better kind of flexibility training than full range of motion training, right?
Right.
So you just get more and more flexible. Has that happened like for different movements for you?
Oh, absolutely. I remember even like my first round of form videos I sent over to you. You were like, "Hey, can you get like it was a dumbbell low incline bench? Like, hey, can you bring that all over your shoulders?" I was like, "No, I can't." And then honestly, for me, I don't know if it was so much the case. So I have seen flexibility improve a bit on like an RDL is a great example of that. But then like I know some of it too was for me just like honestly, I wasn't even like I was just stopping it short, and I just wasn't really thinking about like where am I taking this at the bottom
Right.
of every rep? Which kind of, I imagine you're going to touch on the idea of terminal consistency later, but kind of ties into that more than anything. But I feel like honestly for me, just which I think most people just aren't super aware of, like what what is the actual range of motion that I can take this through, right? I think most people kind of just arbitrarily like, oh, that feels like about the bottom of the rep. All right, time to go back up.
Yeah, for me, I forever was doing bench presses short of touching my chest.
Right.
And just slowly over the weeks, as I thought I was getting stronger and adding weight, I was actually just not coming down as far each time.
Exactly.
And it's so easy to do that. But you're cutting yourself, like you think you're progressing, but in fact, you're shortening your range of motion. And I mean, if we're like taking the depths of what volume is and how important volume is, I mean, you could take into account like how far are you bringing down the weight, and that's almost like volume because that attributes more total volume if you've got a larger range of motion. But anyway, something you brought up there, and I think it's a really great point to touch on, is the terminal consistency. So having like a clear start and end point. Uh, when you aren't using passive range, you use active range, it's so hard to know exactly where you're stopping, I imagine. I don't often try it, but I know when I was doing it, at least, I thought I was stopping at the same point, but it's hard to know
Right.
because you could come lower because you could quite comfortably come through some passive range quite safely and comfortably. So you kind of have to just kind of hope that you're coming into the right range because active range is without load, but when you're training, you have load. So trying to gauge that can be really challenging, but just in for itself, things like, for me, a bent over barbell row, touching the ground, touching my belly, knowing that if I can't do one of those two, something's gone wrong.
Right.
And knowing for my logbook, and we know how important progressive overload is, we can't logbook our lift and be like, okay, so this week I got 8 reps to the floor of my belly and 4 reps, like, I don't know, a quarter to my belly, and then like, I don't know, however many centimeters away. It's just like, how do we know? We're just kind of guessing. It's kind of like if you do 6 reps and then like your mate helps you with 4 reps or something. It's like,
Right.
how are we log booking that? Like we're training past failure, but it's like, how do we even know where we are right now? We're just kind of guessing essentially. And we're just kind of a little bit broy in a sense where we're just hoping we train hard. It feels hard. Surely it's going to work. And it's like, well, that will work as a beginner, maybe an intermediate, but as you get more advanced, we have to force our body to progress. And no better way than objectively knowing this is how I lift, full range of motion, here to here. I did this weight for this reps last week or last month, and this time I've done more. And now you can objectively say, like, I've probably grown muscle because I can see on paper my form's the same, and I've seen that progress come through.
Right. And I think that's been one of my biggest realizations over the last even 3 to 4 months. And I know we've talked about this a lot because for me, it's like, what the fuck? How did I not like think about this before? Like, I think that so many people, when you pass, like, when you get to kind of that intermediate ish stage, I know you can, I think that a lot of people tell themselves, like, okay, I'm not growing. I must just not be working hard enough. I need to push harder. Or, like, similarly, like, okay, I need to do more volume, but without like quantifying volume as like, are you consistent with how you're performing each rep within like each hard set? And again, I know for me, I've had to rework so many movements. Even like the first time I shot form videos over to you for the last week of my first meso, I was like, oh man, like that's actually how that looks. Like, okay, now I kind of this is clicking with me a little bit more. And I've had to drop the load on so many of my movements. It's been a big ego check for sure. Like, honestly, most of my movements, like, how did I not think about before? Like, how did I not realize that my last 5 lateral raises were literally like half the range of motion of my first 10, right? So I feel like that is such a big, but when you talk about it, it sounds very simple. It's like, yeah, I feel like that should just
Yeah.
almost be intuitive to everyone. But I feel like, and I know, like, I missed this for years, even as someone that's been coaching for years, been studying program for a long ass time. I feel like it's such a foundational piece that just gets overlooked.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is. And I think, unfortunately, especially men, are saying this as a man, I feel like I can say it a little bit, but I feel like sometimes we think we're more advanced than we are, and we
Oh,
see
absolutely.
advanced, and we think advanced is better, and we think advanced principles mean more results. And
Right.
it actually means like you don't want to be advanced. The more advanced you are, the more like slow results are and everything. But to get the benefit of the advanced concepts, you have to have done all the basics. And the basics a lot of people just don't want to think about them. It's like, it's basic, like that's like not fun stuff. That's like stuff that's not going to provide much reward. But no, it's actually like they're the things that are going to give you the biggest bang per buck. And you like so many, like for me, even it wasn't until I don't know how many years of lifting that I finally like drew everything back. And I was that guy like low bar squatting just to parallel because it was the most load on the bar. And I thought more
Exactly.
load, more hypertrophy, right?
Right.
So, but unfortunately, that's not how muscle works, is it? So, like the muscle doesn't know how much load you've got on your back. It just knows that it's getting a particular amount of mechanical tension through a particular range of motion. And like the greater the range of motion, the more muscle fibers and the more muscle that's going to be activated and stressed. And actually, the great thing is if you do have to lower the load, probably less fatigue is then produced. So for
Right.
me, like particularly low bar squats would beat up my like hips, my kind of my shoulders and my like wrists, everything would be a bit beat up, but just centrally fatigued because the axial loading through it, or just have that. Or if like you see someone using, well, leg press is a perfect example. They come down like quarter of the way versus the full way. They can use like, I don't know, 10 times the amount of load almost, it
Right.
seems. And then it's like, but you have just tried, you've tried really hard. And this comes back to the point of trying hard. And there's like, you can try hard and that hardness can be going and leading you nowhere. You're just trying hard and not getting anywhere because that quarter range with loads of load feels really hard. Just like maybe a bozo bot squat feels really hard, but you need to direct your hardness towards the specific things that are going to lead to hypertrophy, which is full range of motion, standardized technique, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's a discussion that it does feel like no brainer,
Right.
but it so many advanced, like I got there and I was like late intermediate probably, and I hadn't really respected these things. And I probably get better every month that I train where I'm just like, I think I can probably clean that technique up a little bit, or I can
Right.
bring that back. And that's okay. I think a lot of people feel like when they lower the load, they're reducing the mechanical tension and they're reducing the hypertrophic stimulus. It's like, no, you're probably increasing it, especially if you're increasing range of motion, you're increasing mind muscle connection with that kind of muscle group. You're probably providing more mechanical tension now to that muscle group and you're doing a better job. And maybe you can even do more volume. And because volume has a dose response with hypertrophy, and if you so you recover from it, maybe you even grow more now you've reduced the load. You should actually. So yeah, rather it should, in a way you can, it feels like an ego hit, but then it can almost be a bit of an ego boost when you're like, oh cool, like I feel like I'm cheating the system now, I'm using less weight, getting more volume, growing more now. Damn, that's pretty sick.
Right. No, I couldn't agree more. So, on a similar note, then actually, can you explain this idea of, because also important when we're talking about exercise selection, this idea of stimulus to fatigue ratio?
Yes, so that was great because specificity, compoundness, and range of motion for me kind of can be summarized through stimulus to fatigue ratio. In that specificity, it needs to have the muscle that you're trying to target is the specific limiting factor, which is important for stimulus.
Right.
So for example, like if you're trying to build your quads, and like some people might use a low bar squat, it probably isn't the most specific exercise you could use to build the quads. Probably a high bar squat with heels raised, potentially allowing you to sit really deep. That's probably a slightly more specific movement for that. You're going to get more stimulus towards the quads, less overall fatigue developed. So again, that's improving the stimulus to fatigue ratio. Again, compoundedness, I talked about more muscle groups involved, bigger kind of homeostatic disruption. It's going to be a big stimulus. So a really easy example to talk about on that is the deadlift. Huge amounts of stimulus through deadlifts off the floor.
I was
You
going
have
to ask
something.
about this actually.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I might end up covering some of it, or we might touch more later. But yeah, I mean, deadlifting off the floor, so many muscles are involved. There's a huge stimulus, but at the same time, there's a huge fatigue cost because so many muscles are involved with that movement. And
Right.
really, not that many are taken through a full range of motion, like a full stretch and full contraction. That's not really happening. But it is a huge stimulus. So maybe we can improve that, maybe take it through a larger range of motion, which comes to my third point, which is like a deficit kind of deadlift, maybe. Now, probably lowering the load, but we're taking now the glutes probably through a fuller range motion. The quads are now probably through a fuller range motion, the adductors. So now we're maybe changing that movement to be slightly more stimulative and slightly less fatigue. And that was through a range of motion manipulation. Or
Right.
same with like the leg press was the easy example for stimulus to fatigue ratio. You kind of range of motion, you bring it down a quarter of the way versus the whole way. the load difference, like you're going to get way more stimulus coming all the way down with way less fatigue versus coming down a quarter of the way, much less stimulus, way more fatigue. So yeah, through that we can really pick our exercises. And like a good way just to think about stimulus fatigue ratio is how much stimulus am I getting through that local musculature that I'm trying to target versus fatigue, which is just a general, like how hard did it feel like it was to do that set, how kind of disrupted are other muscle groups, how fatigued are your joints, kind of ligaments, how beat up do you feel from doing that set. And that can help you really pick movements through kind of stimulus fatigue ratio. And as a bodybuilder, it doesn't matter like load, whatever, stimulus is what we're after. That's exactly it. And as we get more advanced, and actually for any bodybuilder, kind of because we know volume is kind of a dose response to hypertrophy, the less fatigue we've got, the more kind of stimulus we can provide ourselves. And so as you get more advanced, you really have to be careful with your stimulus to fatigue, because every ounce of stimulus costs you that fatigue. And we only have so much we can play with as a advanced bodybuilder, because yeah, you just start racking up, and your MRV is kind of the gap between your minimum effective volume and your MRV is so much smaller. So we have to be careful with fatigue. Basically, fatigue management is just like super important as advanced. So it upsets me seeing quite strong, very advanced people. They can get huge stimulus from like the deadlift or various movements, and it's like, but that might be giving you tremendous fatigue that it's just
Right.
not worth that movement anymore. And so maybe we can modify it, maybe slow the eccentrics down, put a pause in there, add range of motion somehow. But yeah, that's kind of stimulus to fatigue ratio.
Okay. Okay. Super, super helpful.
Oh,
So
good.
then, specific to the individual, so like at the start of a meso, for example, what are you looking for, if anything, to like quote unquote make sure a movement is a good fit? Like I know, for example, the first week of our training, we'll look at, okay, how is your pump? How is your disruption, etc.
Cool. So yeah, it's something I always ask, because I look at form videos and you can really try and assess it from like a biomechanics standpoint, or like exercise like physics. But if it's meeting kind of the musts of an exercise, so for the squat, they're sitting all the way down, their heels are on the ground, their lower back isn't rounding, like they might round a little bit, but as long as they're in neutral, that's okay. Like a bit of butt wink is
Right.
okay, not excessive, and it's under control. Like if it looks kind of, it might then, they might have a wider stance, a narrower stance. They might, I don't know, it could just look different because people have different anthropology and different kind of hip sockets and everything like that. So you might have to have a different width and stance. And so it might look a bit not how I squat, but I'll just be like, so it ticks all the boxes. How does it feel?
Right.
To them. And then this is where it comes in, like how does the stimulus towards the quad feel, how does kind of the disruption feel? And these are two things I like to ask people about, and it really helps individuals take care of their form and execution, because you almost can't feel these things if you don't take care of like mind muscle connection and other things. Because if you're not thinking about stimulus and disruption, you're just kind of, you could just be going through the movement. And I never used to think about these things, but
Right.
because a lot of bodybuilding training and programming, I think, came from strength training. So for a strength training, they don't really worry about, oh, what's the pump and the disruption. Like
Right.
these things don't really mean much to them necessarily. Whereas for us, it's like these could be some potential markers of how effective that movement was for us. So after they've completed, say, their high bar squats, how did your quads feel? Did they feel like they got somewhat of a pump? So did the muscle feel somewhat full, of like blood? And people generally know the pump, sorry. So like, yeah, did it feel full? Did it feel like swollen? That sort of sensation? Did it feel like it was kind of bursting? And that, in a sense, is also useful because cell swelling is a potential avenue for hypertrophy. It seems to be like cell swelling, metabolic stress. It's a bit mixed, the
Right.
data on that in terms of evidence. I still think it makes sense to use it as a gauge, and some of the theory behind it is kind of pretty compelling. But at the end of the day, we don't, because all the mechanisms kind of work at the same time,
Right.
as in we have mechanical tension, but you've got tension on the muscle, it can still get a pump, it can still get like metabolic stress. So it's like, what's working here? Is it all just mechanical tension, or is it these other things? So yeah, so the pump can be an indicator of like cell swelling, which could be an indicator of hypertrophy. I think it's useful. And generally, if you've got a good pump, you've had a good mind muscle connection, which means that muscle is probably the limiting factor for you versus others. Like if you've done a high bar squat and I ask you about it and you're like, oh, I just felt it all in my lower back. My lower back was pumped. My quads weren't at all. Then I'm like, oh, maybe we can modify the movement to do this, or maybe we should actually just move to a hack squat or something.
Right.
And then some muscles don't get very pumped. So for me, I always bring up the example of mostly my hamstrings just never really get much of a pump.
Right.
Like, and like, yeah, I don't know if there's any others. And mostly just hamstrings. They seem to be the only one that doesn't really get much of a pump. Most other muscles do. My biceps don't get much of a pump either. They just kind of feel, yeah, they just kind of feel disrupted would be the term that I use. So that's kind of like, for me, hamstrings feel tight. Actually, my biceps kind of feel tight, but they also just feel kind of like tired and almost damaged in a way. You just know something's happened there. You know something's been disrupted. So I always use the example of like, I do leg curls and then I'll stand up and then I'll like look to like lift my legs. So I'm like, oh yeah, my hamstrings feel tight. They feel heavy. They might even quiver a little bit, especially like biceps. Like if I've trained biceps pretty hard during the day and then I lift my arm up, quite often, like the bicep, I can just feel like my arm's kind of like quivering and it's like shaking. It's like, well, like I lift up a plate for dinner and Charlotte's like, why is your arm shaking? I'm like, yeah, I trained biceps today or something. So that's kind of where disruption can come in and it can be helpful. And then the other thing I consider after that is how are you recovering? So the next days, how are you feeling in terms of, did you get any soreness? Soreness can be an indicator that you've done some homeostatic disruption. So if the next day or during the day you feel kind of like maybe fatigued or potentially even a little bit of soreness, that can be a good indicator that you've done some kind of like work towards that muscle group. Because at the end of the day, like we are trying to elicit a decent stress to disrupt homeostasis to cause like an adaptation and then eventually grow. So yeah, those are some of the things that I'm looking at to help clients gauge whether a movement feels all right to them. And I will say sometimes some movements they don't feel necessarily like they get you a major pump or major disruption, but you just know they're doing something really good. And that is like incredibly bro-ish. And I think the bros often are proved right. And I'm going to use that as my kind of way of evidencing it. But something like a bent over row, for example, for me, bent over rows have been a bread and butter movement for years now. And I never really get like major pump on them and never like obviously disrupted. Like maybe if I do like a machine row and I really squeeze it and feel it, but there's just something about that movement that I know it's doing something really productive and I'm progressing with it really well. And since introducing it, like parts of my back have grown like nothing else. So I think you can't just use like pump and disruption as your only markers, because I think you'd end up potentially just biasing all your movements to like isolation based movements, because they often like it's easy to feel the mind muscle connection and stuff like leg extensions. You can feel like crazy pump mind muscle connection, but the amount of leg extensions you have to do to build your quads versus having big compound movements in there that are hugely stimulating, we know that would be like not great. And then you get into like the stimulus to time ratio. So it's like, how much time does that stimulus, like how much time do you have to spend getting that like bit of stimulus for you? So yeah, that's, I guess, some things that I use during that kind of, particularly in that first week, but also later weeks, kind of having to assess things as well.
Okay. I love it. And I remember having a conversation actually about when I first saw my program, I was like, why would we do barbell bent row as opposed to like step back isolateral hammer strength row? Again, I was super deep into like matching up resistance profiles with strength curves. And you were like, a lot of bodybuilders used to bend over row to get jacked for a long time. Fair enough. But since then I've had the same experience too. Like I used to hate bent over rows just because I didn't think that as a movement it made that much sense. But I just like you said, like after my back always feels disrupted, I've seen my back grow a lot from it. And I've very much enjoyed the movement now. So I think there's absolutely something to just like, this has worked for a lot of people for a long time and we can't just disregard that.
Yeah, I think so long as it doesn't obviously outrightly kind of not fit with any of the principles. I was trying to think of a good word, but I can think of one. So for example, I will say like a above the knee rack pull. Like a lot of bodybuilders who are super jacked, I think, use that. I don't actually know, but people use this kind of argument. Oh yeah, they have huge traps, like huge lower back or whatever, real back thickness. But it's like, but when we look at specificity, compoundness, ROM, how many of these things is it ticking? Not that many. But when you look at a bent over row, like it's got a good range of motion, especially if you do it actually bent over, which is another discussion for another day. A lot of people don't quite do that movement correctly, I don't think. And then when you look at like specificity and things, like the back is the limiting factor in that movement. So I think as long as it doesn't like, you can look at what they did and put it through the principles, and if it ticks off a lot of them, you're like, oh, okay, actually, like maybe there is something to it. Definitely.
Okay. Okay. I love it. So as far as the mind muscle connection goes, then if someone is complaining of, for example, I can't feel my biceps, right? Are you automatically going to say like, okay, how do you coach people through that? This is definitely something that's evolved for me a lot, but I'm interested, like your thoughts, like, are we going to, okay, maybe we look for a different exercise, or maybe like, hey, just check these boxes and it doesn't matter that much if you can feel it or not.
Cool. Yeah, it's really common. The first thing, and immediately when you said that question, this is what came to mind, is like, I want to see it. I want to see you doing this,
Right.
because how are you performing it? Because oftentimes it can literally just be a technique thing where it's like, well, this is why you can't feel it, because you're not really using the muscle. But like you said there, quite often you'll check it and you'll be like, well, your bicep has to be moving. Like you're doing the bicep curl controlled in a manner that has to be using the forearm. The bicep. Like there's no way that you can't be using your bicep. So if we're progressing that movement over time, your bicep has to be growing. So whilst you're not feeling it, it is doing what we need it to be doing. And you could always try and like ask them, try a different variant, especially for something like biceps. There's so many different variations for
Right.
biceps, and it's an isolation movement. So technique isn't something that's like takes age. It's not complex. It's just like you're just curling the arm, right? So
Right.
it's super simple. So I might say like, okay, so you don't feel it there, maybe try it on a cable or dumbbell, barbell, easy bar. Maybe try like a spider curl or like facing away. A really good one for biceps in particular is like, because there's some movements that you just can't help but feel almost. But
Right.
so like a standing away from the cable stack. I think Menno calls it like a Bayesian curl,
Yeah.
where you stand away from the base, from the stack, and you face away from it, and it's kind of, so it's pulling you in the stretch position, and then you're coming all the way up. You like, so the kind of resistance profile, I guess, is pretty good on that movement as well from that standpoint. And like you can't almost help but feel the biceps in a movement like that. So there are some things you can do, or like on chest. Like some people won't feel their chest when they're pressing. And there might be some times where you're like, okay, so especially if their triceps say pre-fatigue or fatigue first before their chest, you might even do a pre-fatigue. So you might say, okay, let's make sure we do an isolation movement for the chest, do a fly, really fatigue the chest. You almost can't help but feel flies, especially like cable flies or a machine fly, where you really hold and squeeze that peak contraction. And then when they go into a chest press, hopefully now the limiting factor is going to be the chest, so they will feel their chest more in that movement. But yeah, those are the main strategies. But even just simply like warming up, maybe not for the biceps, because you can't really like do too much warming up for the biceps, and typically they're towards the end of the session after your pulling movements. But
Right.
particularly for like back, for me, when I used to train back, now I can connect with my back immediately, pretty much without having to do like any extensive warming up. Previously, I couldn't, so I'd almost do these kind of like activation sets where they're basically just warm ups, where I do like cable pull-ins, like cable pullovers, and just really kind of loads of reps in reserve, really light, and just kind of really kind of squeezing and doing my best to feel that muscle activating. So then when I went into movements, it was very warmed up. I almost couldn't fail to connect with it. So there's some of the strategies I would use at least.
Okay. Okay. And I would say, as far as like feeling the mind muscle connection, one of the things that's been most helpful for me has been focusing on all these other things we've talked about and not trying so hard to feel the muscle. So, for example, I know like for me with biceps for a long time, I was so frustrated. Like, why can't I feel my biceps working? So I do these very slow concentrics with super lightweight. Like, I really want to feel my biceps squeeze. I really want to feel it squeeze. But then like I wasn't then when I like really analyzed it, I was like, okay, my range of motion isn't where it needs to be. So now, and typically what I work through with clients now is like first and foremost, because often, like you said, like when people shoot over form videos, most often I'll see like, okay, range of motion isn't consistent from the first rep to the last. And it almost looks like on the concentric, you're trying too hard to feel the muscle, which is likely reducing your load. Whereas if you try to be more explosive on the concentric, and then maybe we're going to slow that eccentric down to like 2 to 4 seconds, as opposed to like right now you're just dropping the weight. And then I found that for most people, just working through a checklist, and of course, like hitting your RIR targets and working through a checklist list like that seems to be super helpful. And I know for me personally, it was like again, like for whatever reason, I don't get much of a pump in my biceps, but afterwards now, like once I stumbled across that, it was very much like, oh man, like my arms hurt now. So I think that for many people, at least personally, I found that very helpful with a lot of clients.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. And one other one I've just thought of is I don't know if you've had like people with abs. Quite often people don't feel their
Oh
abs
yeah,
when they're doing like cable crunches or something. And often it is a technique thing, but particularly, and this goes across the board for if they don't feel a muscle group, generally, like you just said there, like not worrying too much about like slowing down the concentric. I mean, you don't need to, like, there's no research kind of backing up slow concentrics for muscle growth or anything.
right.
So doing that pretty explosively under control, great. Then slowing down the eccentric. So particularly hamstrings come in mind on like
Oh yeah,
RDLs or straight leg deadlifts, good mornings. People rush that eccentric so much, and the eccentric is important to control. So generally, especially on abs, I've always found this, like getting people to really slow down that eccentric, pause when they're fully kind of contracted at the bottom, trying to like crunch the abs and shorten them fully, and then release. So yeah, slow eccentrics and then like pausing at the kind of bottom tends to help people a lot, or like the shortened position.
I love it. I love it. Super helpful. So then let's dive into rep ranges. Do you have what's kind of your thought process behind like applying rep ranges to a movement, or even across let's actually talk across a training week, because we have like DUP, all these different methodologies. What are your thought processes when we're like, okay, these are the rep ranges I'm assigning to this movement?
Cool. So yeah, I think from an exercise standpoint, there are certain rep ranges that just make sense or aren't practical for certain exercises. So, for example, a bicep curl, we talk about biceps, you're probably not going to find doing less than maybe 6 reps very practical. So I tend to program biceps exclusively like 10 plus. And
Right.
the same would go for like lateral raises. They don't tend to do so well less than 10. When you try and do like heavy lateral raises or heavy bicep curls, just tends to be a lot of momentum that comes in, and that
Right.
doesn't seem to be super productive. Similarly, on like leg curls or on leg extensions for legs, doing less than 10 reps doesn't seem super productive for those movements. Feel a bit uncomfortable, a little bit awkward. You could do it, but there's better movements for that. So like a squat would be great in like the heavier 5 to 10 rep range versus like you probably don't want to do much more than maybe like 15 reps on
Right.
a like high bar back squat. More than 15 reps is going to be real tough. And it's unlikely when we come back to exercise, like principled exercise selection, specificity, is the quad going to be the limiting factor if you're doing 15 plus reps on a high bar back squat? I imagine maybe lower back or cardiovascular. Same with like a straight leg deadlift or a hip hinge. More than 15 reps, I think probably the lower back's just going to start being the limiting factor on that movement versus the hamstrings or the glutes, which we're trying to target. So there's a few kind of just isolation movements pretty exclusively a 10 plus for the most part. And then compound lifts probably pretty exclusively up to like, some can probably go up to 20, but most are probably 5 to 15, just seem to make more sense in that rep range. So that just practically will have an influence on kind of what exercises are in what rep ranges. And then in terms of just hypertrophy, we pretty much know now that almost any load you can use up to 30% of your 1 rep max is likely to be almost equivocal for hypertrophy, so long as we're close enough to failure, particularly for repetitions above 5 reps. When we start dropping below 5 reps, there's just so little volume that we're accumulating, that we're potentially losing a little bit of that hypertrophic stimulus, and the fatigue produced from less than 5 repetitions is really high, and that's more strength training. So whilst you can definitely cause growth through less than 5 reps, it's probably just not the most efficient use of your time, and fatigue management. So I tend to stick within 5 to 30 repetitions. I like to bias more so towards probably on average the 10 to 20 rep range. And
Okay.
if I was to even close that smaller, I'd say 10 to 15. I find that to be probably the best kind of position where you're getting plenty of mechanical tension, good amounts of metabolic stress. You can do lots of good volume with that. It works for a lot of exercises. But I will work between the 5 to 30 because it's kind of like, why not? And we do have some evidence to suggest that higher repetition work is going to be more hypertrophic towards slow twitch muscle fibers. Lower repetition work is going to be more hypertrophic towards faster twitch muscle fibers. We want to maximize the growth of both if we're a bodybuilder. So let's use the full spectrum. And then just from like variety sake, for our joints, ligaments, that sort of thing, it makes sense to have some variety in there and utilize some daily undulating kind of programming, I would call it, because it's kind of not a periodization tool as such. So within a program, I will use some DUP through the week. So I might focus on having more heavy work at the start of the week and some more lighter work towards the end of the week. So for example, quads, for legs, I quite often will have like a quad dominant session, and that might have some lighter hamstring work. And then I'll have like a hamstring dominant session with some lighter quad work. And that kind of allows you to really kind of target certain muscle fibers and particular areas, allow them to kind of recover and then hit them again, but potentially a little bit differently, maybe hit the muscles slightly differently, use some different exercises. And that tends to lead to the best adaptations because you're just getting a really good stimulus recovery adaptation, which allows you to then get the most productive volume done and again, maximize your stimulus for the fatigue that you're producing in that sense. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but those are some of the things I do at least.
No, absolutely. That makes complete sense. And again, it comes down to specificity, right? Like basically training within the 5 to 30 rep range seems to be the most efficient for hypertrophy. And it doesn't make sense to like, I know I've had programs in the past where I was programmed like a 5x5 of leg extensions and just like intuitively, like, well, even like maybe if we're looking at like volume on paper, it might make sense. Like if you've done like five, or same thing with like leg curls, it just doesn't work as well in real life as it maybe would in theory, which even in that case, it's kind of like, but
How did
anyways,
that feel?
not good.
I'm just thinking, I don't think I've ever done that before. So yeah, I'm just leg extensions particularly. I'm just thinking, how'd that feel on the knees? And
Right.
yeah,
Right. Exactly. And I definitely subbed it out for like higher reps. But anyways, I think honestly, I think there's a lot more of this just like, again, kind of intuitively makes sense. Like, okay, I train like whatever, I hit my chest with a whatever 5x10 barbell incline press earlier in the week. It makes sense for like, okay, maybe I'm going to get some higher rep work later in the week, so on and so forth.
yeah, I think especially as maybe if you're novice and you're quite new, well, the kind of running joke for novices is anything will work as long
Right.
as they train. But for when you're more intermediate, more advanced, when you've substantially disrupted a certain area, it takes a while to recover. And so for you to kind of smash your chest and do a barbell bench press heavy 5 to 10 for 5 sets or something, and then to expect to be able to do that within like another few days, your performance is probably going to be down versus that. But other areas of your chest or other muscle fibers are recovered enough so you can do some lighter work that allows you to continue to grow muscle, but through a different avenue. So it just kind of like you've kind of damaged and kind of got your growth from this aspect. Let's kind of just use a different aspect later in the week and then come back to that once you've recovered from that aspect again. It just, that seems to be the main benefit from like the undulations, is just that recovery component that you don't get.
Right. Okay. Okay. Perfect. So then one thing I want to dive into you as well is the topic of static volume across a meso versus progressing volume. Now, I already have a good idea of what your take on this, but I'd love if you would share with the listeners as well. Like, what are your thoughts on this? Because I know, especially lately, this is something that there's been a lot of back and forth on.
Yeah, definitely. I'm kind of smiling because I have a podcast tomorrow with Eric Helms, Brian Miner, Jared Feather, and Mike Israetel.
Oh, let's go. I'm
Yeah.
stoked to hear that.
So I'm very excited to moderate that and talk through everything, because I really, really hope it bridges the gap between their two methodologies. I don't think they're going to agree at the end. I don't think they're going to come to, oh, this is the ultimate
Right.
avenue to go down, because I don't think there is an ultimate avenue. I don't think we know enough yet. I simply don't think we know enough. And it's really interesting because like Eric and Mike in particular, those guys have been in the industry for a long, long time. They've specialized with bodybuilding, muscle growth for a long, long time, both incredibly smart, individuals, but have this different opinion on where we should go with our volume. And I would first of all say, um, I don't think Eric, I will probably leave using kind of Eric as the static guy and Mike as the volume increasing guy. Because if I'm honest, I know both Eric and Mike will both flip. So Mike might have static volume at times. Eric might have volume increasing at times via sets. So I know there isn't like, they don't have their standard black and white. This is me, I'm static guy, I'm volume increasing guy. So to just dissect static versus kind of increasing, I think both can definitely work. And it obviously can work because people use both and get great results. And I think that comes down to the fact that we're working with sufficient volume. So long as we're working within our minimum effective range to our max recoverable. So by definition, that's like your maximal adaptive volume. So the most volume you can do and recover from and adapt to, then you're going to be growing. It just then comes down to, is there some benefit towards starting with less? So starting around minimum effective volume, and then is there any benefit to working towards a maximal recoverable volume
Right.
through set increases? And then that's where the discussion comes really. What is best? Is the fact of, if I can recover from more volume, does that mean I can potentially grow more? Or does that just mean you're getting better at doing more volume? You're not actually growing from that volume. And that's a good question. We don't know. But so I think this is just like a chat you could probably do. Well, obviously I'm going to do an entire podcast on it, so I could probably go for ages on it, but to kind of say where I'm at the moment, my mind might change when the discussion is done. But where I am with it at the moment is that I see changing sets as another tool in our toolbox for programming for hypertrophy. I never used to use it. I always was just like, I don't know, like 4x8 or whatever it is. I change rep ranges, I change intensities, I'd use RPE, but I never thought about sets. I was just kind of like, sets are just like this thing that you don't change. And that doesn't make sense to me now when I think about it. It's like, it doesn't make sense. Why would you not change, especially when we think about hard sets as kind of the thing that we use for determining kind of the hypertrophic stimulus? Why would we not change that, the thing that is so dose dependent towards hypertrophy? And then the idea of starting at minimum effective volume, to me at the start of the mesocycle, makes tons of sense. Why would we not start with the least we can do to get the most? And then auto-regulating through a mesocycle to keep the stimulus as high as possible. And again, that's a point I guess you could argue. But if I'm working with someone and they are feeling incredibly well recovered, and they're progressing well, and potentially they're like, my pumps are okay, the disruptions feels pretty good, but I know I can handle more.
Right.
I'm like, well, I don't have any good reason to suggest you shouldn't do more, especially if you've got the foundation of excellent technique, good like fatigue management, and you're not going to like risk just injuring yourself. Then I'm like, well, yeah, why don't we do a bit more and work towards this max recoverable volume? And then the argument is overreaching necessary? I don't think most people need to overreach. I think there is some evidence to suggest, especially for advanced trainees, it could be beneficial. But it's then, if you don't work towards this MRV, what do you work towards? How do you know what your kind of limits are? How do you know what volume to pick? How are we picking that volume? We're just kind of basing it off, like, did you progress this mesocycle? And then if you didn't progress, are you recovered? Maybe add more volume. I mean, sure, you could do it that way.
Right.
But from my own experience, and this is where I'll just get into like my answer, I guess, from my own experience personally, from using more static approaches versus the kind of building through sets, I found way more growth through building sets. And for clients as well, I found that. And I don't know if that's necessarily the sets, but the whole system as a whole intuitively kind of makes a lot of sense to me. Also, when explained, it makes a lot of sense, and it's something that I really enjoy, and I found my clients enjoy, and it just seems to be a method that is incredibly productive. And yeah, on the surface of it, I can't say people must program this way, but at the moment, especially in like bodybuilding training, like we don't have tons of research, especially long-term research looking into this sort of thing. So I think you have to, if you're just going to go by the evidence, I think you could be a little bit behind what might be best. So I guess, yeah, in a roundabout way, I like to use sets as another tool. I won't say like every week I add sets, like it's auto-regulated based off someone's recovery ability, and also time comes into it. I do have clients who they can't afford to add any more volume because they simply don't have, like, they can't train more than an hour, so potentially they're capped. And then there's different ways of working through things with them.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. First and foremost, man, I know we're already almost at an hour. Do you have a bit more time, or do you need to run right at the hour?
Oh no, I can do a bit more time. It's all
Okay.
good.
Okay. Perfect. So, would you mind then diving into like what is your progression? Like, what's your system for progressing across the meso?
Cool. So yeah, when I'm looking at a single mesocycle, I do start at that minimum. Well, I try to start at the minimum effective volume. I'm not super anal about this has to be minimum effective volume. Like, I know it's like 10 sets for this muscle, 7 for this one, 6 for this, whatever it is. It needs to be in the range of, I just know we're doing enough to grow, but there's definitely more that we could do and recover from. So we're starting with like a lower level, and I'll base that off um, either someone's training history. If I've been working with them a while, like, we just kind of know whereabouts it is, because it doesn't change too much over time. It will change a little bit over time and through exercise selection as well. But if they're brand new and I don't have any training history, I'll probably start at kind of the averages that we have through the scientific literature, which seems to be maybe 8 to 10 sets for most muscle groups, a bit less for the kind of legs, a bit more for kind of the upper body. Oftentimes, through my experience, back in particular, people tend to be able to handle more through the back. That's whereabouts I'll start, and a little bit less for some of the kind of isolation muscle groups, which will be hit through the big compound lifts through the main muscle groups. So around 8 to 10 sets. But I'll also in that week be assessing through the pump and disruption. In that, I think if we're getting low to medium pump and disruption for those muscle groups, we're probably doing enough to grow. If we're getting high pumps and high disruption, we're probably doing more than enough to
Right.
grow and could potentially get away with less. So the good thing with pump and disruption is not only am I getting a good assessment of how is their technique, my muscle connection, how's that movement for them in terms of stimulus to fatigue ratio, but I'm also getting an understanding of, are they doing enough? Because
Right.
they might have perfect execution, perfect mind muscle connection, spot on with their RAR, but they're like, didn't feel anything. And maybe they could have done with another set then to just make sure they're getting a stimulus. And that's where I struggle with like not using sets as something you modify, because, well, if you program them 3 sets, but they do their session, they've definitely got close enough to failure, they've got excellent technique, range of motion, it's great movement for them, but they just, the next day, they don't really feel anything. The later that day, they don't really feel anything. It's like, well, surely we should just give them a little bit more if they're
Right.
recovering really easily from that. So yeah, that's the way I feel there. So that's where I start. Kind of, I could call this a foundational week, kind of just making sure that they've got technique there, they've got their RAR there, we've got minimum effective intensity, minimum effective volume, and I start around 3 to 4 RAR, particularly for the big compound lifts, closer to 2 to 3 for the isolation lifts. I think isolation lifts are a little bit more forgiving, and people can push them a little bit further often than they think they can.
Right.
Like, you can just kind of eke out another rep, and they're safer to go to failure on as well. As I posted just recently on my story, yourself, Jeremiah, kind of
Means the
taking lifts
world.
to basically to true failure. I
Right.
loved it. It was great. It was a perfect example of, like, people are often scared to hit failure. It's like, on a lateral raise, what's going to go wrong? You're just not going to be able to lift your arms up.
Right.
So, and that's what you did. You just kept going consistent form. It's just like, arms didn't go there, so let's stop. And
Right.
you truly hit like well, you basically hit failure actually, because you attempted a rep and you couldn't complete it, which on an isolation lift is perfect. So anyway, so starting around 3 to 4, 2 to 3 for isolation, 3 to 4 for compound, and then I will move up each week in potentially volume, depending on how they're recovering. Something I assess is readiness. So when people come to train a muscle group, I will ask them, how recovered are you in that muscle group? Are you fresh, fatigued, or are you okay? If someone is like a little bit sore, but their performance is good, then that's like an okay score. If they're coming in that session like fully fresh, performance is great, that means they're fresh. That means probably they can handle a bit more in their next kind of session for that muscle group. And if they're fatigued, then we might even bring sets down. And again, that's why, again, sets can be super helpful, because you might end up doing too much. And it's like, well, let's bring it down. That
Right.
sometimes happens for, like, if someone's doing a new hamstring movement, or they are new to doing kind of a hip hinge with slow eccentrics and like keeping a bit of lordosis and that sort of thing. Sometimes the hamstrings just end up getting some sort of stimulus they've never had before. We might have to reduce sets in that sense. So yeah, I'm moving the potentially sets up based off recovery, and then RAR will effectively drop because they'll be making things a little bit harder. So they either add a little bit of load, or an extra repetition. That might be in some weeks they repeat RAR because they simply just adapted that well. But for most intermediate to advanced, most people I work with, they're seeing that RAR drop by 1 every week. So it moves from 3 to 4 to 2 to 3 and 1 to 2 for the isolation movements. And then each week that will keep going. So we're progressively overload relatively on the week prior by adding a bit of load or an extra rep, letting reps in reserve come down, auto-regulate sets based off recovery. And then eventually MRV will hit us. So our max recoverable volume will be met by it. I don't ever seek to hit it sometimes. And for me, especially, I don't tend to ever hit my MRV. I basically always go over it because I know the next week I couldn't even match that performance. And for a lot of my clients, they end up actually sometimes just going over their MRV rather
Right.
than necessarily meeting it. It's just like they look at what they did that week and they're like, I went to 0 RAR or 1 RAR on all movements. I couldn't even meet this next week. And
Right.
so that's, in a sense, they know they've gone over their MRV. So that typically I'll accumulate for 4 to, on average with the people I work, 4 to 6 weeks for most people. Most people it's 4 to 5. And I work with mainly late intermediates to advanced people. So yeah, and the terminology I would use for the movement from MEV up to MRV, MAV is in between. So that's where we're trying to milk that progression out for as long as possible. So we're just trying to add a little bit of load. We know that we're doing more than minimum effective volume. So we know we're growing and it's just about staying in that zone for as long as possible. And we auto-regulate sets upwards based off recovery because MAV tends to auto-regulate upwards with us. So what once was maximal recoverable, maximal adaptive volume was maybe 12 sets for a muscle group. Next week, it might be 13 sets because
Right.
now you've adapted to that amount of volume you do. At the end, once I've hit MRV via deload, so this brings down volume to roughly like maintenance volumes for that week. I'll really reduce load towards the end of that towards the end of that microcycle, at the end of that week. And I'll also reduce reps. So reps in reserve are like nothing during that week. Very easy. The beginning of the deload week, some of that might feel a bit heavy. I do keep a bit of heavier loading at the start of the week. And then towards the end, I make it super light, super easy. So we get tons of recovery, potentially a little bit of resensitization in that week so that we can come back in to the next mesocycle, back at minimum effective volume, and then progress through again like that.
Perfect. So many applicable takeaways from that. And again, I want to be super respectful of your time, man. I know we're already over our allotted time here, but
I'm good for time.
I feel like this
So, right.
gives the listener a huge amount of takeaways as far as basically just putting together a smart training phase or putting together a mesocycle. Before I let you go, Steve, do you want to let the listeners know like where they can find you? Anything at all you'd like to plug?
No, yeah, thank you so much for letting me talk through things and having this chat. I appreciate it. And yeah, if people want to find out more, if they want to contact me, Revive on Instagram is where I'm at. That's kind of the place I probably spend most of my time. If people want to send me a DM or check out the stuff there, and then revivestronger.com, they can find our coaching services, the members site, any of our ebooks or anything like that. The podcast is there as well, or they can search any podcast provider, Revive Stronger, and they can check that out. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Perfect. I will link all of that up in the show notes. And again, thank you for being here, man.
Cheers.